Hello and welcome to the fourth part of our series, Parenting for a Peaceful World, Building Connected Childhood for Times of Crisis. And this fourth part is called What Did I Want as a Child? How to be an empathic adult who helps to nurture children's emotional intelligence and help them to face the uncertainties of the world. The reason behind this particular presentation is that in recent years there's been so much research into the human stress response, and there's been a trend showing that the main factor behind our children's emotional resilience, what gives them the strength to face and move through life's challenges, stresses, shocks and even trauma, what makes the greatest difference is how well our children's emotional needs were met during the key formative stages of early life development. And there are 7 key developmental phases of early life that I will be talking about today, showing you what we've learnt about the emotional needs, the psychological emotional needs of children that underpin their responses to stress later in life, their resilience, as well as the way that they relate to themselves, the way that they relate to other people and to the world. And childhood, spanning all the way from just before birth through the baby toddler years, school, and the teenage, the adolescent years. Why those years are so important in a formative sense is that those are the times in which the human brain is growing at the fastest rate. Very, very busy growing. So the brain continues to be subject to change for the rest of our years. You've probably heard about the neuroplasticity. Our brains learn from experience and continue to modify and adapt. However, because the brain is growing at a particularly rapid pace in early childhood and again through the adolescent years, this means that we go through the most profound changes, foundational changes to the way that we respond in the world during those key formative times. That's why childhood is so important. So the purpose of this talk is to help us to understand our children better. What are their needs? What motivates them? To learn how to prepare our children as well as possible for realistically the unexpected challenges that take place in anybody's life. At the same time as understanding our children better, this will help you to understand yourself a lot better. Based on key formative experiences from your own early life, it will help you, as you understand your children better, to understand your own strengths that you gain from childhood and perhaps areas in which you might have felt wounded psychologically, emotionally, and what are the impacts of those wounds. But even more importantly, how do we help to heal those emotional wounds that most of us would have experienced at some time or another during our key formative years? I also like to call those emotional wounds developmental wounds because they affect us for the long term. So let's begin by asking the question, why do our children behave the way that they do? We'll be looking at the main drivers of our children's, let's say, personality. Personality is the common noun used. In other words, their style, their predictable style of relating to themselves and to others. And our children's response to stress in life. The everyday stresses, but also the big stresses. What drives the shaping of all of that and how can we best help them. And leading edge science has shown us that there are two main influences behind who our children are, the way that they behave and relate. The first is, of course, genetic. And our genes don't exactly determine our personality. That's what leading edge genetic science is teaching us. Our genes influence things like temperament and, of course, some of our talents and our gifts. And that's a good thing. Human society is strengthened by diversity. We are meant to be team members, all of us quite different, with different strengths and different vulnerabilities, so that we fit into the whole and have different things to contribute to the world. And of course, some genes will move children to be more extroverted, some to be more introverted, some to be more thoughtful, some to be more humorous. We're supposed to have those differences. However, our genes do not determine, they do not lock us into psychological dysfunction like anxiety or depression or angry outbursts. That's not just our genes. The second factor is environmental. What is key for the way that we develop psychologically is human relationships. That's because in our early life, our brains are growing at the fastest rate that they will go through the entire lifespan, which means that we're so much more absorbent to the influence of our environment when we're babies, toddlers, children, and adolescents. In fact, the way that it works, it's as if our brains are watching the world, sensing how people are around us, and adapting, taking notes from human relationships and modifying, adapting accordingly. We make adaptations to our childhood experiences, the beautiful experiences as well as the painful, disappointing experiences, and we change accordingly. That's why these early stages of development that I will talk to you about are so powerful in shaping who we become, our strengths and our struggles. Let's look at, in our first slide, why is it so important to understand our children's emotional and developmental needs? And by the way, I'll be focusing on emotional developmental needs. In this talk, I'm not covering physiological needs, I'm not covering cognitive needs. That's a subject for another place, another day. And that's because the emotional developmental needs, these core developmental needs that are the same for all human beings across all cultures, across all nations, across all ethnic groups. These core neurobiological emotional needs are so formative for the way that we are shaping our response to the stresses of life and our manner of relating to other human beings. And it's important to understand those needs so that we can best help our children in their capacity to move through the challenges of life. But also because when our children are hurting, they often show their feelings and their needs in an indirect way. It's unusual for our children, especially little children, to be able to language clearly and directly some of their deepest feelings. Words might fail them, or sometimes they're afraid to reveal. They might be ashamed or afraid to reveal the truth of their deepest feelings. So it's helpful for us as elders, parents, grandparents, and teachers to know a developmental map that helps us to decode our most baffling and bewildering behavior in our children. Here are some of the ways in which our children express their needs and their hurts indirectly. They might do so by acting out, by misbehaving, mistreating themselves or each other. They might do so by becoming withdrawn, moving away from contact with others, disappearing into themselves. Sometimes they show their pain and their needs by becoming very, very clingy, where they just can't bear to let you go. At other times, they might show their pain and their need by becoming overly pleasing, desperate for approval, the extremely good boy, the extremely good girl, very, very super obedient and submissive, terrified that somebody might be mad at them or disappointed in them, hungry for recognition. Often, children show that something is hurting and that there is an unmet need by regressing. Their behavior changes as if they're a much younger emotional age. You might see, for instance, a 7-year-old child who's gone through something very, very frightening. They feel threatened and they begin to suck their thumb almost like a baby. That's one example of regression, and there are many others. Sometimes the deepest hurts and needs are expressed through an illness, physiological symptoms, and now science has explained why that happens. We've understood that deep chronic emotional stress, feelings of alienation, loneliness, fear, when it goes on for a while, it really weakens our immune system and leaves us open to all kinds of disease. Or even when children have a lot of accidents, when they're accident prone, this might well be a sign that there is an unmet need or more. So today I want to share with you a developmental map in which we look at the changing core emotional, psychological needs across 7 different stages from earliest infancy all the way through to the end of adolescence. And the science and clinical experience behind developmental psychology and the map that I want to share with you today comes from a range of endeavors, beginning with prenatal and perinatal psychology research, infant attachment research, which is incredibly abundant these days, research into breastfeeding, and even the psychological, neuropsychological impact of early life nutrition, developmental neuropsychology, the understanding of the way relationships change and determine the direction of brain growth with long-term consequences, learning theory, and also the work of somatic psychotherapists for several decades. I wanted to mention a very, very important statement from Dr. Bruce Perry. Bruce Perry is the world's leading infant and child traumatologist. He is by training a child psychiatrist, an author of many books. He is a very well-known lecturer in the subject around the world. And he has made a statement which I think is very, very meaningful and clears many myths about childhood. And he said this: children are not resilient, children are malleable. What this means is that, yes, babies, children, adolescents, when there's been something traumatic or very scary, very shocking to them, they do bounce back, but they don't bounce back the same. They bounce back with some changes. That's the wisdom of evolution. When we meet a very frightening moment in life, a very stressful moment in life, particularly as children, we are changed by that. We adapt. It's as if our neurology uses that as information, telling us the kind of world that we need to prepare ourselves for. So we come back with alterations to our stress response. It doesn't mean we're broken. We can still be able to be happy and loving when we feel safe, but it changes our response to the threats, challenges, and stresses of life. This is because, as Dr. Bruce Perry and many other developmental neuropsychologists have explained, in terms of our core developmental needs, there is, you could say, a neurological expectation of what needs to happen. And those biological expectations change with every developmental stage. Every stage brings a different theme. And when those needs aren't met, there is a hurt that happens. When those needs are insufficiently met, the organism must adapt to prepare itself for the kind of world that is being indicated by those experiences. We change by our experiences. So here's how the developmental map that I want to show you will help you. First of all, it will help you not to harbor unrealistic expectations about what your children can do in each developmental stage. In other words, not expecting a 4-year-old to be able to respond emotionally, for example, in a way that you would expect from a 17-year-old. So it does help to understand the limitations of each stage. The map will also help you to decipher your child's behavior as a code indicating some of the deepest needs that they're not able to language for you in that moment. It will help you to understand the protests of your child, to understand their reactions emotionally, to understand those more deeply, and not to blame them, to judge them for the emotional reactions, the outbursts that they have sometimes. It will show you how best to address the core underlying emotional need. In other words, feeding their strength and their resilience for their future, for the rest of their lifespan. But also, this is going to help you to understand yourself a lot more, understanding the strengths that you gained from your childhood, as well as potentially places where you might have felt wounded and why sometimes you overreact, or why sometimes you might become detached under stress, dissociated under stress. To understand yourself a lot better, to have a lot more compassion for yourself, but also to understand what might bring you some healing for your own woundedness, as well as learning more about how to heal your child when your child is emotionally wounded. Here's one more thing to understand about what happens when core emotional needs are not met. When a child undergoes a traumatic moment or a traumatic episode in their life, a moment of great fear, great grief, great shame, it's not simply what happens in that moment to hurt your child that has the long-term effect. It's what happens after a trauma or hurt that can make all of the difference to the long-term outcome. This is very, very helpful to understand. It's what happens afterwards. I want to share with you that it is never too late for healing. 5 minutes after your child is hurt, 5 weeks, 5 months, or even 5 years, there are things that we can do to address our emotional wounds and to help us to unfold, to come back to an open-hearted and courageous place. And here's one of the strongest hints: validating our child's deepest emotional needs, validating our child's feelings. That's the ultimate healing experience for our child. This, by the way, is also true for us as adults. Validation of the needs and feelings. Notice I'm not saying validation of behavior. That's very, very different. There are still behaviors that we must say no to, especially if children are fighting and hurting one another. Of course we must say no. But that doesn't mean not understanding the emotions that underlie our children's misbehavior. Once that's validated, our children heal. They open up. They listen much more. They're more willing to be guided by us. And they move on. They behave a lot better. That's the ultimate outcome. Now, so many benefits to understanding developmental needs. We'll get deep ahas about our children's hurt, their misbehavior, help them thrive, maximize their emotional well-being, which in turn affects their physical well-being for the long term. Helps them to have better relationships as they grow up. It'll help us to understand ourselves, why we overreact sometimes, why we have relationship difficulties sometimes. How do we heal ourselves? How do we help our children to heal? Ultimately, there's a shared benefit in this understanding that as our children grow up in better and better emotional health, that's what underpins healthier and more loving, more joyous relationships. What this means is that improving childhood improves all of society. This is how we create a more harmonious and more sustainable society, ultimately a more harmonious and more sustainable world. Children treat the world as they've been treated, primarily. So that the way that we respond to our children's core emotional needs is likely to be the most powerful form of social change activism that any human being can bring to bear. I'll talk about that a little bit more towards the end of this presentation. Now, let's look at the 7 stages of psycho-emotional development and the different needs that come up with each stage.